even the ones that we scratch our heads and say, why is this in the Bible? This is a great example of a story that, why is this in the Bible? The key to everything, the story behind the stories in the Bible is Genesis 3:15. That promise God made to crush the serpent's head through the seed of the woman. And if you follow that line, and all the times that Satan tries and almost succeeds in intercepting that seed along the way, you can see what's going on. If you're reading these stories simply as sort of Bible history and not as the unfolding drama of redemption, then it's just not going to make that much sense. It's going to lose its... The thing that's going on here that's most important, there are lots of things that are important, but that's most important is what you mentioned, Bob, that this promise that God made in Genesis 3:15 cannot be fulfilled unless God keeps that line going to Jesus.
Welcome to White Horse Inn. We are starting a new series called The Mothers of Jesus. 5 women are mentioned in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew. Who are they? Why are these women mentioned among the many men who connect Jesus to Abraham? What lessons do they teach us even today? This series leading up to Christmas allows us to see Jesus through the eyes of his mothers, who all looked in faith for his appearing. Jesus' genealogy in Matthew 1 recites 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 more from David to the Babylonian exile, and 14 more from the exile to Christ. But Matthew's symmetrical genealogy is much more subtle than one might think. For one thing, contrary to the patriarchal mentality of the time, Matthew has inserted 5 women, Gentile women, into the long list of men, which is a fascinating innovation. None of these women's names, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary, are found in Luke's genealogy. All but Mary are Gentiles, and this is done on purpose that they're mentioned, and this should cause us to ask some questions. Who are these women, and why are they there? 4 of these women are included early in the genealogy, and Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah. And Matthew included these particular women while passing over other matriarchs like Sarah and Rebecca and Leah. Matthew's readers who knew the Hebrew scriptures well likely would have been jolted at finding those names in the list. They might have even been embarrassed, especially when they saw Tamar's name in Genesis 38, which recounts when she was pretending to be a prostitute and her father-in-law, Judah, had sex with her. The twins born of that union are the 2 that are listed in Matthew's list. The story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38 highlights that Tamar is widowed and therefore vulnerable, that she's rejected in a humiliating way, but she's resilient and gets what's rightfully hers in a surprising manner. When the whole story is over, Tamar is the one who is declared righteous. So to discuss all 5 of these mothers of Jesus, and particularly for this episode, Tamar, are Mike Horton, professor of theology at Westminster Seminary, California, Bob Hiller, pastor of Community Lutheran Church in Escondido, and Walter Strickland, theology professor at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary and elder at Imago Dei. And I'm Justin Holcomb, bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Central Florida and professor at Reformed Theological Seminary. Gentlemen, before we focus specifically on Genesis 38, let's go back to these genealogies. There's a genealogy in Luke, which is not the same as Matthew. And so let's explore and compare those 2 genealogies. What's happening there between these 2 genealogies?
Well, the genealogy in Luke, if I'm not mistaken, goes all the way back to Adam. And the genealogy in Matthew begins with Abraham. One works backwards from Jesus to Adam. That's the Luke one. Matthew's begins with Abraham and ends with Jesus, which indicates to me a couple of things. One, Matthew's audience needs to hear the gospel in this way. Jesus is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. Luke's audience probably needs to hear the gospel in this way. Jesus has come to be the new Adam, the savior of the whole world. And so you're doing a little reading into things here, or I'm doing a little reading into things here, but it does seem that the nature of these genealogies lends itself to who we believe the audiences are for Matthew and for Luke.
And it shows, doesn't it, Irenaeus was right, the second century church father, when he said that it's a symphony.
Yeah.
He called it the fourfold gospel, not the four gospels, but the fourfold gospel. You don't get the same audience, you don't get the same emphases, but you get the same gospel. And different audiences hear the gospel in different ways, and it reminds us how important the location of the hearers is in how they hear it.
Yeah, and in Matthew's gospel, it just seems that that genealogy is tailored to that Jewish audience by demonstrating that Jesus is the fulfillment of Jewish prophecies.
Right.
And so that's just kind of one of those simple realities there. And to play off what Bob said, then Luke, there's a humanity-wide focus for Luke. And so I think those are just, as you were saying, are tailored to those audiences that they're writing to.
Yeah, you have Jesus is the descendant of David, so therefore he's the fulfillment of these prophecies. And then you have, usually genealogies weren't done through the mother's side of line, but virgin births are also unusual, and so it's appropriate.
They are, aren't they?
Okay. So that's helpful to notice. So we just want to address that if you're looking at one genealogy and another going, oh, wait, why aren't these exactly the same? What's going on? And so that's just, as we're attending to scripture and again, seeing the symphony language that was going on there.
One of the other things that's interesting is I make this, I don't want to make too hard of a distinction that Luke is for the world and Matthew is just for the Jews. Because, Justin, you pointed out something very interesting. The women who are listed in Matthew's genealogy, I think all four of them, apart and not Mary, but all four of them are Gentiles. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I think that's pretty remarkable.
Yes. Yeah, you have Tamar and Rahab are Canaanites. Ruth is a Moabite. Bathsheba is probably a Hittite.
Right, right.
I think that's interesting, too, in the light of Ezekiel 16, where Israel thinks that they have this inviolable covenant to the land, and they can't get kicked out, regardless of what the law actually said in Deuteronomy 28. And so God is coming to them and saying, yeah, I don't think that you remember. It's not like you're like, there's this eternal Abraham form that you belong to. Here's what he says in Ezekiel 16. As he, is abandoning the Jerusalem temple. Again, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, make known to Jerusalem her abominations, and say, thus says the Lord God of Jerusalem, your origin and your birth are of the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite, and your mother a Hittite. And as for your birth, on the day you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to cleanse you, nor rubbed with salt, nor wrapped in swaddling clothes. No, I pitied you to do any of these things to you out of compassion for you, but you were cast out on the open field, for you were abhorred on the day you were born. And when I passed by you and saw you wallowing in your blood, I said to you in your blood, live. And I said to you in your blood, live. I made you flourish like a plant of the field. And then he goes on and talks about, I saw you grow up, then I married you, and I've given you all of my wealth, and here's what you've done with it. So basically, God putting Israel in the position of the Gentiles. When Israel's pointing the fingers at the world and saying, bad world out there, those Gentiles, they're going to get it. God is saying to his own church, your father was a Canaanite and your mom was an Amorite.
And your father smelt of elderberries.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I think what we're saying is really helpful because since primeval history, prior to the Tower of Babel, what have you, we're seeing that this is a story for the entire world.
Yeah.
And then what we have in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3 is a zooming into a singular family through whom all the world will be blessed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in light of Matthew's genealogy being written to demonstrate that Jesus is the fulfillment of all the promises to that Jewish audience that would consider those significant, he's sort of reminding us, hey, this is for all people. And in fact, there are real contributions Tamar, Rahab, and also Ruth that we'll talk about, Bathsheba, that are off that really help move this narrative forward. And so while we're seeing that Matthew's gospel is sort of focused at God's people, I think that's actually a grace in there, an intentional grace to remind Jewish folks, hey, this Messiah whom we're getting to in this genealogy is for all the world.
Quite the stories with these ladies too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's interesting. It's not Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, though their stories are pretty phenomenal on their own. But like as we'll see today, like the story of Tamar, this is a pretty jacked up, sinful situation. Rahab was a temple prostitute for pagan gods. I mean, there's this sense in which the inclusion of these women in the genealogy demonstrates to us that this is not a story about sort of the pristine history of Israel, but about the graciousness of the God who saves.
This is actually the group of people Jesus spent most time with.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good
when
point.
he was born.
Well, let's put a bow on this first part of just looking at this the whole genealogies. Let me conclude something on this: is that you look at the Apostle Paul, the apostle for the Gentiles, and when people are wondering what in the world is he doing, and he in Acts refers to Isaiah and talks about, no, this is part of the plan of Messiah for the world. And Isaiah didn't start that. That was before Isaiah, all the way back to what we were just talking about, but particularly Tamar. The fact that this story in Genesis 38 is already has in the line is this Canaanite woman. So let's tell the story. Who can summarize what's happening in Genesis 38 so we don't just read an entire chapter for the whole episode? Let's tell the story.
Yeah, so what we have Judah's family. This is Leah's fourth son. They're now living in Canaan, amongst the people that are not worshiping Yahweh. And Judah, he has three sons, and to his oldest son, he arranges a marriage with a woman named Tamar, who we're focusing on in this first episode. So for this first son, essentially, he's a wicked man. There's not a lot of detail about his wickedness, the nature of his wickedness, but God being just, he ends up killing the first son. The second son, Onan, was given Tamar to marry, and he made it so that she wouldn't get pregnant. And because of that wickedness, that we can articulate the nature of that more later, God then kills him.
What a masterful way to summarize that.
Yeah.
He made it so. Go ahead.
That kept it a family show.
Yeah. I'm trying to keep it. Not.
That was impressive. I just want to highlight how I was wondering how you're going to get around that one. And you did it.
Well, so the thing is, I have a lot to say about that, but we're gonna wait till we can sort of dive in on Onan, because I know we're gonna pile on him and beat him up pretty bad.
Oh, we've all had that used against us in youth group and Son of Onan. So we'll come back to that.
So now you have Judah. He's now a little bit shaken. He says, okay, every son that marries Tamar dies. So he has this son, Selah, who he was a little bit younger, and he used that as an excuse not to give this third son to marry Tamar. And so what happens is that Tamar is given this excuse and told to go live with her father's house, even though it was Judah's job to protect her. So what she finds out later is that Selah is old enough now to be married. Judah has not given Tamar Selah to marry. And so now Tamar starts to take action. So and during all this, you have Judah's wife passing, and then he's going to go take a trip to have his sheep sheared. And Tamar gets word of this journey to go to the sheep shearers. She then disguises herself as a prostitute, puts herself in a place where Judah will notice her. Her plan works. He then sees her, beckons her over, thinking she's a prostitute, sleeps with her. But before she says, okay, so what's payment going to be? Okay, well, I have some animals at home. I'll bring those to you. So she says, well, I need some collateral, So she says, give me some stuff. So staff and,
signet ring
and things like this, all things that identify exactly the person whom she slept with. Turns out later she's pregnant. And then Judah says, this woman needs to be burned. She needs to be killed for her infidelity. And then she goes, well, it's actually interesting that you say that because the person who I slept with, I have his things. Takes out the signet ring, takes out all the things that she got from him. And
you are the man.
What's that?
You are the man.
Yes, you are the man. He says that she is more righteous than I am. And there are so many things for us to talk about in this story. And so I'm just glad to sort of give the PG version of that. So now we can get into the details of the shenanigans.
That really was a great summary.
Well done.
Well
done.
You had all the texture in it. That was, thank you. I do appreciate it. And that sets us up. Let's just jump into, we hear about the sin of Onan, the sin of Judah. Why is their response? Why was she vulnerable? And what did they do wrong that they should have done differently? That actually tells us, it sets up, and you said very well, why would she be called righteous for doing something like this? And we'll explain that in just a second. So sin of Onan, sin of Judah. What is it?
There's a law in Israel, I never say it right, but the Levirate marriage law. I say it right now. That's good. The Levirate marriage law, which said if the firstborn son dies with no children, that means the household is kind of up in the air who's going to take care of the household. And so the second in line was then to take into his house the widow to sleep with her and have a child. And so then that child, I believe, would carry on the family name into the next generation. And so that's part of the responsibility here that Onan was supposed to take on. And Onan said, I'm not interested in responsibility, but I still like to sleep around a little bit. And so he didn't do his job. Judah should have been, in a sense, overseeing this and didn't seem to worry too much about it once Onan died, and so he's also not doing his job according to the law.
And I think in the background, and I think many of our listeners will understand this, but just in case there's somebody out there who doesn't, Tamar was in a particularly sort of vulnerable situation here. The reason why the Levirate marriage was in existence is because a woman also had zero ability to protect herself.
That's good.
She was a woman couldn't own land. She wasn't heir to anything. And so in addition to what Bob mentioned, the Levirate marriage was also to help protect women from being just completely destitute, without help, without protection and things like that.
Yeah. The other thing probably worth keeping in mind is, because this does take place before the law is given, there's also something here in which Onan is working against the promise, and Judah is working against the promise. So God says to Eve, one of your descendants, one of your seed is going to crush the serpent's head. And then he says to Abraham, I'm going to give you descendants as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the sea. And Onan doesn't seem to be too interested in the promises of Abraham. Judah, by not arranging the next marriage, is not interested in the promises. So not only are they working against the Levirate marriage law, they're working against the promises of God.
That's an important point, Bob, because it's actually the center of the story. The way to read all of Scripture, all the episodes, even the ones that we scratch our heads and say, why is this in the Bible? This is a great example of a story that, why is this in the Bible? The key to everything, the story behind the stories in the Bible is Genesis 3:15. That promise God made to crush the serpent's head through the seed of the woman. And if you follow that line, and all the times that Satan tries and almost succeeds in intercepting that seed along the way, you can see what's going on. If you're reading these stories simply as sort of Bible history, and not as the unfolding drama of redemption, then it's just not going to make that much sense. It's going to lose its... The thing that's going on here that's most important, there are lots of things that are important, but that's most important is what you mentioned, Bob, that this promise that God made in Genesis 3:15 cannot be fulfilled unless God keeps that line going to Jesus.
Right.
And Mike, that's a very important point, which explains exactly why this story interrupts the story of Joseph.
Yep.
Hmm.
Yep.
So, I mean, if you like these last 10 chapters, I think, of Genesis are dedicated to this story, and all of a sudden we get a little bit of whiplash in saying, okay, so now we have this insertion of this Judah Tamar situation, and if you're reading with a biblical theological sort of framework, or just looking to the Messiah, the Lord Jesus or God fulfilling the promises, then this actually does make sense. And so I just thought I'd interject that as well.
It also explains why she's called righteous at the end, because her actions are not necessarily moral. If you read this as a moral story, like what are the kids in youth group supposed to do at the end of this one? Like, I don't know.
Dare to be a Tamar.
What?
and don't masturbate. I mean, that literally,
right.
This is the passage is given.
You had
a
lot of those talks. I can tell you're bitter,
gosh.
and
And I gave those talks. I mean, I did this.
Yeah.
I mean, I gave what was given to me. I was like, okay, apparently this is the go-to passage on teenage sexual exploration.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, she's righteous.
Yep.
Because she works in line with the promise, even though her actions seem to be way out of line and seem to be wildly immoral. She's more in line with the promise than anybody else in the story.
She's not justified by her works. It's
exactly
obvious
right.
that she's not.
Obviously.
Yeah, but she's justified by her faith.
Right. Yep.
In fact, that's Hebrews, right? Hebrews 11. This hall of faith.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a hall of works, the writer of the Hebrews says, but a hall of faith.
Yeah, pulling that thread from Genesis 3:15 all the way through that you guys have done, and that's what I like so much about your summary, Walter, because it was clear you were summarizing the story with the past and the present in mind, but still telling the story, and that's the fact of seed and offspring being the thread where you have, we talked about she was vulnerable because she was widowed, but she's rejected and she's humiliated because Onan, and what he's doing is saying it's better for my seed to rot in the ground than to be in your womb, Tamar. I mean, it is a humiliating thing, but it's also working. I mean, not just humiliating, but working against the promise is what Bob was talking about. And then Judah himself has a responsibility. And that's why, again, Walter, when you were just telling the story about, I mean, you could feel like the manipulation of, okay, I'm going to protect my son. I don't like this. You're not wanted. But it's more than just the sin against her. It's the working against the promise. But then her defiance, her going after what's rightfully hers. Let's turn a little bit toward that because it's not moral, all that. But there is this defiance that is noteworthy to explore.
Yeah, there is. I'm not an expert in this, but it strikes me from what I've read that it's not usual in the ancient Near East for women to have this kind of leading role in a story in which the men come out looking bad. And the women look like they're strong, they're courageous, a little cunning. They can plot just as men can. They can defend themselves. They have agency. There really is a presence of women in the Old Testament generally, and in stories like this, that seems pretty out of place in the ancient Near East.
Yep, and because usually something that's being celebrated in the text, her defiance sometimes gets twisted to be like she's conniving like Eve. Like, no, that's the purpose of telling the story isn't to show how she's trying to usurp and be conniving and deceptive. Yeah, there's deception involved, but this is layered, and pointing to this defiance is important. And God is so creative and sovereign; He can bend evil somehow and to turn it into blessing. Doesn't make evil good, but He can bend it. He can use it. And I think that's the story the Bible's always telling, is if we go through and you look at the people that God uses, they're train wrecks complete train wrecks all over because the point is not works, but going back to what Mike said, the hall of faith is the trust in the promise and hearing the promise and which is, I mean, we are telling these stories leading up to Christmas. And these are the mothers. This is not the typical Christmas story that we tell, but how does this Genesis 38 Tamar story relate to churches and families in this time where we're gearing up, in Advent, gearing toward incarnation and Christmas?
It's oftentimes when we talk about Christmas, we talk about baby Jesus. It's this very sterilized story. It seems it's like all roses and things like that. This cute little nativities, bows, silver bells, people from, just all those little trimmings. But the reality is that we have a Savior who is coming to save people who are dead, people who could not save themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and there's a reality that we miss when we're talking about the people that God, put on flesh to save. And so I think we do ourselves a disservice by sterilizing the Christmas story, because the reality is that if we would look back on people even in this genealogy in Matthew, we want to cancel most of them in today's culture. Not incorporate them into the genealogy of the Messiah.
Right.
So I think this actually gives us some hope, because now we see, okay, even these people are justified by their faith, despite their works that are just all over the place. And so now we too, because of this child king, can have hope. And I think it just, as we look at this story, think of think of Judah and Onan and Selah and Tamar. We're just like, you know what? That is an absolute disaster. And so when you look around your dinner table at Christmas, it might be an absolute disaster.
That's so good. That's
but
so
God
good,
is working, and He's not left you alone.
Wow, Walter, that's dark, but it's good. I think too, what strikes me from the story is the writer to the Hebrews saying that we do not have an unsympathetic high priest. He has been tempted in every way, even as we are, yet without sin. So all of these ancestors he had were victims, as we are, of original sin.
Yep.
And sinners and sinned against. But Jesus was only sinned against, and in every way like us, except for sin. So that sin, that corruption that we see in all these stories, is also wrapped up in a lot of our stories as we're sitting around that Christmas table. But there's one person at the table who is exactly like us and has been tempted exactly as we have, but without sin. And He's sufficient to save.
If I could bring some Luther into the conversation, Luther says this on the whole Tamar situation, and I think it applies perfectly here. Such sins of the saints are recounted at such length, so fully for our comfort, to the end that we may know that the patriarchs and saintly matrons were like us. Sometimes they accomplished great and sublime things that we can by no means attain or imitate. Sometimes, however, they perpetuated foolish, ridiculous, yes, the very worst of outrageous sins, in order that God alone might be glorified in our works, both good and evil, in the good works which He Himself has done in us, and in the evil works which He has forgiven in His mercy. It's a great line, and it does get me thinking about, actually, I love what you said, Walter, that like you look around the table, and at Christmas, you heard that line, like churches will say things like, oh, Christmas is about families. Christmas is about redemption of disastrous families.
Amen.
Like Christmas is the season for people who need to know that they have a Messiah who came in to their situation that is filled with divorce and betrayal and bitterness and backstabbing, and that's the world we live in. This is the place we find ourselves, and that's the world that Christ has come to redeem, and we are the sinners that Christ has come to forgive. This is the point of Christmas.
Yeah.
let's turn toward Jesus and see how this connection of clearly that's given to us because it's in the genealogy of Jesus. But Mike, you said early on, these are the women Jesus spent time with in his ministry, and that just jumped out. All of them fit that kind of picture, and literally, it's in his heritage, it's in his DNA, in both because he's fully God. And this is the heart of God. This, I mean, this the compassion God has for those who are in the situation that many of the women in Jesus' genealogy, but also in his lineage. I mean, this is his lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk more about this connection to Jesus, the obvious in the genealogy, but let's explore some of these overlaps and threads.
Well, think of the Samaritan woman, right? She is a double outcast. She's a Samaritan. Jews never talked to Samaritans. They passed them on the road if they were lying in a ditch. That's why Jesus tells that parable. A rabbi would never become ritually impure by touching a Samaritan. And here is a rabbi talking to her, and she acknowledges that this doesn't usually happen. Why are you talking to me? There's a sense here she's tentatively asking her questions because she didn't get that opportunity to ask questions of a rabbi. So she's not only a Samaritan who was considered a dog, not even a person, but secondly she was a woman, and rabbis didn't talk to women. And so on both counts, what Jesus is doing there is, there's no law in the Bible against that, but the rabbis had piled up all these new rules and regulations, and Jesus just steps over them.
And you know what? Just to your point, Mike, the new rules and regulations that they've given were a fence around the law, and Jesus consistently broke not the law, but the fence around the law to demonstrate the ridiculousness of that fence. Because of that, he demonstrates love to women, in particular women, that would seem particularly unlovable.
I think also the Syrophoenician woman who comes to Jesus asking for her daughter to be healed, and Jesus seemingly ignores her and sends her away and almost insults her. It's not right to take the food from the table and throw it to the dogs. And she says, Luther says she catches him in his word and he's happy to be caught when she says, that's right, but even the dogs get to eat the scraps that fall from the table. And he's like, oh, your faith, this is what I've been looking for, finally. In a Gentile woman, this is exactly what I was hoping for, Jesus who hopes for things. But you get the idea. This is the faith Jesus wanted. And it's very similar here, like to the rest of the world. She looks like someone who should be on the outs. Tamar looks like someone who should be on the outs. And yet, with her word, with her faith, she's justified. She's declared righteous, even though everything about her suggests she should be otherwise. Which also I wonder then if there's not an interesting kind of typological connection to Mary here. Like to the rest of the world, Mary looks like she's pretty immoral. Not everyone's buying the whole virgin birth story, I'm sure. And yet, she's fully vindicated through her faith, and it's the same with Tamar. She looks to be the immoral one, but she's vindicated through her faith.
And that brings up Judah. I'm going to come right back to that point about her being vindicated, but different from many men in Hebrew scriptures, ancient Near East, and in Jesus's time. Judah repents and confesses and declares. And so there's humility in this, which is actually, that's a great example. Like, look to him as an example. That's how you respond.
You're more righteous than I.
That's not normal. And a lot of the men in Jesus' time were like, can we get some stones to kill her? And Jesus had to go to bat and abdicate for numerous times. So that's noteworthy. But because of his declaration of she is more righteous, she is cleared, she's vindicated, and she's now blessed. Because of this, she's now going to have the children that bring forth Boaz and David and Jesus. And so that, just going back to the typologies, there might be a typology, but there's literal heritage here. that stands out. So
Yeah, the idea of she is more righteous than I being said by Judah. It's often that a man is looked to, like we see Joseph in chapter 38, the one who's running, the one who's fleeing, and the woman is the seductress. And I think that this story, told in concert with the following chapter in Genesis, demonstrates that both are in need of redemption. Both work. Both genders are those who have done good and bad things sexually. And so I think that sometimes we focus on, just depending on what church background you come from, women being this sort of seductress, and then men being this sort of person who's able to run from them and flee from them. And that's our task as it pertains to the seductress. And so I think if we teach both of these passages as we're walking through exegetically, it really helps us not to put all the blame on either men or women for this kind of activity. It just is a helpful sort of comparison that God gives us in the Scripture if we're just walking right through them as He gave them to us.
In His declaring of righteous, frequently in the Bible, you have the characters you wouldn't expect to be saying the right things. And so here we are with the guy who just did this, and he's now saying the things that is in line with what God could be saying. That happens with Abraham when he kind of throws his wife to the pagan kings, and it's the pagan kings who say, "What is this that you have done?" Which is literally the words of Yahweh in the garden.
We don't do this in Las Vegas.
But the moral center's not who you thought it would be in the story. Right. Same thing happens with Jonah, where the really good theology comes from all the pagans who was like, who knows, maybe God will be merciful.
Yeah.
And so here's another one
good
where,
example.
As you were hearing the story, we're like, Judah, man, all your sons are like you. That's what's happening. And then he's the one who's like, no, I've sinned, I'm confessing, and she is righteous. And just that's a thread, again, going back to the big picture we're talking about of what kind of story is God telling, and what's He doing with all these crooked lines, and what others meant for evil, God somehow is so creative and sovereign and bends for His purposes.
By God's grace, Judah does take the place of, he was the Pharisee. Now he takes the place of the publican. Says, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner.
Yeah, that's good.
So when the whole story is over, Tamar is the one who is declared righteous, and she is the one who is included in Jesus's genealogy. We have to remember that throughout this whole story, this Tamar is fighting for the line of the Messiah, the promise from Genesis 3:15. By including her and these other notable women in Jesus's genealogy, Matthew is teaching us that God uses the unexpected to bring His unfolding plan to fulfillment. History is not just a linear series of events leading to predictable outcomes. It involves sin and conversion, success, failure, heroes, villains. But God is at work in it, making crooked ways straight and rough ways smooth. And ultimately, God's promises prevail, a truth revealed in the person and work of Jesus Christ. Matthew seems to have another motive also for inserting Tamar in some of these other women, because in an all-male genealogy, because as we said before, they're Gentiles. Tamar and Rahab are Canaanites. Ruth is a Moabite. Bathsheba is probably a Hittite. And their presence in this list foreshadows the Messiah, the role of the Messiah, who opens God's saving plan and promises to Gentiles. Matthew is saying that just as Gentiles are a part of Jesus's lineage, they're also a part of His future. From very early in the lineage of the Messiah, Tamar, a Canaanite woman, is foreshadowing. Matthew includes her, reflecting God's mission from Genesis all the way to the all nations given in the Great Commission in Matthew 28, which is then fulfilled in Revelation. Throughout the Bible, God's people are described as a multi-ethnic multitude that worship Christ because they have been ransomed by His blood. When the whole story is over, Tamar is the one who's declared righteous, and she is the one who is included in the genealogy. She's foreshadowing of the reality that God's people are from every nation, tribe, language, and people. Revelation 5:9 says, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." Revelation 7:9. "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb.'"